No matter how many cases I cover, it still blows my mind that people genuinely believe they can get away with murder. Hi guys, welcome back. Thanks so much for joining me. Today's case is one that you're gonna have to strap in for because yet again we are covering a case where a parent believes that they can treat their child like literal garbage, throw them away essentially, and then carry on freely as if no one's going to notice what's happened to them and no one's going to actually bring them to justice for the horror that's affected that child. The case of Aniya Day-Garrett is one that really makes you consider that there should be some kind of route where you have to pass tests and you have to ensure that you go through certain courses just to be able to have a child. Because time and time again, it feels like these individuals are gifted with the most beautiful children only to treat them in the most diabolical manner possible. It is mind-blowing that this is a repetitive reality. And also, it's mind-blowing how many children are actually being dealt with by child services to some degree, and still it falls through the net where the severity of their situation is concerned. Aniya Day-Garrett was born on September the 2nd, 2013. Her mother, Sierra Day, and I use that term very lightly to describe Sierra Day, she was with a guy called Michael Garrett, that's the biological father. Sierra Day, well, she was born around 1994. I can't find the exact date, but her age was reported as 24 years of age at the time of the verdict coverage. That's in March 2019. So she would have been around 18 or 19 when she gave birth. There isn't a great deal of information out there about Sierra's childhood or upbringing or her particular background. So there is nothing that is outlandish that seems to have happened because we would be aware of that from some of the mitigating factors when it comes down to this particular case. Now, what we do know about Aniya at this point is she is actually attending childcare. So she's going to Harbour Crest Childcare Academy. That means, of course, that Sierra's parenting as a mother takes place alongside regular childcare supervision, which is not atypical at all. Lots of us need help rearing our children because we have to work. Now, one of the things that you note about this particular childcare supervision is they have concerns and they're logging those concerns. So that particular daycare go on to keep a file of 14 child observation reports. So child observation reports are as they sound. They basically document any issues that seem to be concerning. In this case, it's repeated injuries. So over a period of time, and these started basically the earliest in September the 17th, 2015, and they go all the way into early 2017, they're noticing that there are these repeated injuries that are raising alarm bells. Now, the first report that was made on September the 17th, 2015, and the reason for this is one of the daycare staff recorded a bruise on the right side of Aniya's face, and what that particular childcare worker recognised was it looked like the bruise was a handprint. And that's a clear safeguarding issue. So when you get this kind of injury, obviously it draws attention because it is atypical and it's a clear safeguarding issue, as I've said. So the distinct shape of a handprint indicates, first of all, that there's a level of force and that force has deliberately been applied to the face. This isn't accidental. So not only is it deliberately applied to the face, it's likely applied with the intent to harm, to control, or to punish the child. When we look at accidental injuries, they rarely, if ever, result in a clear handprint pattern. A similar facial bruise was also documented just a month later. This is October the 22nd, so within a month, the same handprint pattern. And the staff also noted down that Aniya cried for much of that day, which you would understand because clearly something untoward is happening at home. And certainly when it comes down to that level of physical violence, you can imagine the discomfort that the child would be in. Now, at this point, no formal intervention follows. I would say that's a misstep professionally, but at least they are recording these issues, which does give a timeline and an incident level, which can be actually acknowledged on reflection, which is really important when it comes down to these kind of cases. Now, in November 2016, her biological father, Michael, and Sierra Day separate. Therefore, even though we don't know a lot about their relationship, we can understand that there will have been a level of turbulence building to that point. It's very, very rare that relationships break down without some kind of issue within the household. People aren't getting on. And when you have these kind of situations that are building up over time, what do you feel? You feel stressed. And what we know about perpetrators of violence is the more stressed they are, the more violent they are. Very often, this is when children will go through a significant period of escalated violence. So they break up. And the other thing that we've got to acknowledge is there can be two people living under one roof who are parents who treat their child completely differently. There can be one parent who likes physical violence towards a child because they feel it's disciplinarian route. There is another parent who will be arguing that point and saying that they would actually rather have them in time out or not do any of those things at all, but to just actually acknowledge that they're kids and kids do act out and do behave inappropriately because they're growing and learning as they become the human being that they're going to grow into. But these kind of arguments, they are relatively normal. People do have to find their feet when it comes down to what they expect and accept where parenting is concerned. But the very fact that he's now going to remove himself from that situation, if he is the parent who is non-violent, obviously, for Aniya, that's leaving her in the arms of some kind of predator. And unfortunately, I think in this case, that's exactly what happens. And I'm not blaming the father, by the way. I'm just saying that this is very, very much part of the cycle that we'll see where violence is concerned, particularly when a female is violent in the home as a mother. Because once the man is withdrawn, that protective mechanism that may have prevented more escalations in violence through the mother to the child because he was present, that's gone. And that means that that will escalate. Now, after Aniya is removed, she would typically be with her mother during the week, and then she would visit her father on the weekends. Again, a very typical childcare arrangement, although these days we do tend to move more to a 50-50% when it comes down to breakdowns in relationships. The father is considered as important as the female. Now, during 2016, one of the things that the daycare were observing were these continued issues with physical concerns. They had entries in September, October, and December. So on September the 12th, 2016, staff documented bruising to Aniya's face, to her eye, and to her arm. I think anybody who has children, anyone who has access to children, younger siblings, etc., you relate to the fact this is rare. Kids do get bruised. They do get broken occasionally. They fall out of trees and break their arm, but it's rare and it's not something that is sustained. When you are having consistent injuries, it's very unlikely to be that the child is creating those injuries themselves. It's happening to them. And the very fact that Aniya is constantly wounded to some degree is deeply alarming. Also, September the 21st, 2016, additional bruisings observed under her eye, also on her eyelid. So again, a very similar report to the prior one. How is this child constantly ending up with black eyes? And Aniya actually told the daycare at this moment in time that her mother caused the injury. We then get to October the 25th, 2016. Staff at this point notice that there's a bump on Aniya's head. Again, she's quite fussy. She's crying that day because she's deeply uncomfortable. And also we have to recognise that when you see a bump on the head, that very often you will believe it's a localised injury. She has done it on one occasion, maybe walked into a table. Kids do when they're 2-3 years of age, walk into corners. We know that because of their height. However, what we know in abusive households is that bump on the head may be very, very much aligned with many, many other injuries on the body that they aren't seeing, and internal injuries. So that's why a child can be incredibly fussy, even though to some degree it is just a bump on the head that's being visualised. Now we get to December 2016, and at this point multiple reports are filed noting bruises under her eye. That's on December the 1st and 2nd. So again, this consistency in the type of injury, it tells a story about the abuser. It tells a story about how the abuser is treating the child. Think about the fact that she's got marks on her face that show handprints. That's somebody who is slapping very hard. The fact that she's getting constant cuts under her eyes and bruises under her eyes, again, it suggests a backhand, for example. That's consistent with these kind of injuries, and that absolutely should be something that social care is alerted to and does something very protective for that child. They also noted a rug burn type abrasion on her elbow on December the 6th. Imagine somebody being dragged across a carpet, for example. Also, December the 27th, she had a bruise on her forehead. So lots of injuries. And there were several of these entries recorded where Aniya actually says, this is my mum doing it. So she's indicating her parent being the responsible party. There is one noted that she says both the parents are responsible. But the main point in this is that she constantly draws attention to her mother. She constantly says it's her mother who's the issue. Now that daycare, fortunately, carried out written observations and they continue doing that. And this is when the child protection system begins to contact the family, because daycare staff are obviously deeply concerned that something awful is happening behind closed doors, and they are right to have those concerns. So that daycare facility are ongoing in documenting this kind of issue. It doesn't end once this alarm has been raised. Quite the contrary. She's got more bruises. So bruises in 2017 on Aniya's face, arm, her back. She actually had a raised bruise on her forearm. And that leads us into February 2017, where county caseworkers from Cuyahoga County Children and Family Services, they end up having face-to-face contact with Aniya and her mother. So a social worker had basically met with Aniya at daycare, and that social worker had noticed that there was bruising under Aniya's eye. When they go and question Sierra, she tells the worker that Aniya's run into a table at her great-grandfather's house, which is obviously an explanation that's easy to put out because children do injure themselves that way. It's contextual. Now, that social worker says, okay, I'll accept that potentially that's how it happened, but what about this broader pattern of injuries that have been documented by the daycare? They go all the way back to 2015. And what does Sierra do? She just blames other people. Now, I don't know about you, but if that were the case and I was interviewing that parent, I would have a massive red flag going off in my brain. It's as simple as that. You don't just get to blame everyone else. For example, if you were to ask me about the cuts on my 2-year-old's knee, I would acknowledge responsibility because she was running ahead of me and she fell over and she cut her knee. It's as simple as that. I'm the responsible party. It's not her fault. She's 2.5 years of age. It's my job to do due diligence. It's impossible. We appreciate kids do get injured sometimes, but for the most part, when you're a parent who's responsible, you take that responsibility. You acknowledge the fact that you wish it hadn't happened because you were present and still your child is injured. The fact that she's just protesting that she's got nothing to do with these injuries and she's just giving it to everybody else to blame, that is deeply concerning. Because like I said, if you're an innocent parent, you know you haven't done anything wrong because your child has been injured unless you have created the injury. You can be present, you can be very caring and loving, and still these things happen. You acknowledge when it did. And it's really concerning, like I said, that she is trying to pit this onto other people. Now, the state review, by the way, down the line, they will later understandably criticise how this contact was handled. And they said that the actual investigation itself was closed without even obtaining the daycare's injury report. I mean, how absolutely abhorrent is that? The fact that we have this daycare who is doing their best to some degree. I'm not saying they've been perfect. I think they should have acted sooner, but certainly they're doing the due diligence of recording the injuries and wanting Aniya to be protected. You have a social worker go around, have a conversation. Mum just says, oh, it's got nothing to do with me. And they close that case without even looking at the daycare's injury reports. It's also noted that Sierra and Aniya were never observed together. And yet, damningly, the case file suggests that Aniya and her mother were bonded. Now, the only way you can have that conclusion and reach that conclusion as a social worker is if you've actually observed the two together. You can't just magically make that up in your head and hope that that's the case. Unless this caseworker was also a psychic, which I'm doubting, just down to the fact that this is a terrible case where they fail massively. I'm doubting that they are psychic. This is just pure laziness and wishfulness. It's about wanting it to be okay as opposed to it being okay. It's about ignoring reality and putting a child in the direct path of harm because you are not doing your job. Also, I have real concerns about this particular caseworker because it's the first case that they did without a mentor. So this is the first opportunity you have to actually do a good job or a bad job, to actually prove your worth or to prove that you're worthless. And in this case, they're proving they're worthless. Actually, what they'll probably have figured out here is, oh, I can't be bothered. I'm just going to be lazy. I've not got anybody observing me or mentoring me anymore, so I'll just crack on doing what I want to do. We get to March the 14th, 2017. At this point, daycare staff documented a busted lip. Again, this is harrowing. We are watching this child's abuse literally being noted and recorded, and no one is protecting her. So she has a busted lip. Then 2 months later, on May the 15th, 2017, they also noticed a scrape beneath Aniya's nose. Very unusual. We don't expect to see those kind of injuries on children. Very contextual with people grabbing the nose, twisting the nose. That can very regularly be the reasoning behind those kind of injuries. And the report at this point includes 2 different explanations. So Sierra says that Aniya fell at a park. Of course she did, let me tell you. If she had got scrapes and bruising under her nose, she's going to have lost a tooth. She's going to have bust a lip because that's how it works. Your nose hits the ground, I'll give you that first. But the bruising and the cuts beneath it, you have to actually scrape along to do that. Your lip's going to be a real mess. Your chin's going to be a mess. You're probably going to have marks on your forehead as well if that's the injury. Then Aniya actually says to the staff, no, my mum pushed me at home. Then we get to May the 18th, 2017. This is when Aniya comes to the day centre and actually tells one of the staff that her head hurts. And heartbreakingly, it's the same staff member that's made the previous report on the 15th, and that just makes your heart break for this reason. She obviously sees that person as someone protective. And she's right to, because this person is trying their best to get help for Aniya. So she's going and having that conversation with the person that she needs to have the conversation with. Also, daycare staff, they observe blood blisters in her scalp. Again, completely atypical. Also, they notice bleeding from inside the ear. And at this point, Aniya tells them that her mother had hit her. Could this child be crying out any louder for help? Should this child be resident with her mother at this moment in time? Clearly, she's in an incredibly dangerous situation. It's being acknowledged by the daycare staff. They're doing their best. Now, they call EMS, they call the police, and Aniya at this point is taken to the hospital. The responding officers were actually provided with all 14 daycare injury reports spanning all the way back to 2015. And medical staff, at this point, they noted that the dried blood inside her ear and the fact that she had a scrape on her nose and an abrasion on the top of her head, clearly trying to identify the fact that they have concerns as well that's going to unite with those 14 daycare injury reports. Now, of course, the police speak to Sierra, Aniya's mother, and what does she do? Well, she does what she seems to be very effective at doing. She lies, believe me. Sierra, the mother in this case, is a pathological liar. She does it as if it's going out of fashion. She genuinely seems to be able to breathe at the same rate as lie. It's as simple as that. So she basically says, oh yeah, the injuries are there. Yeah, I can see them. I've had nothing to do with them. They actually happened at my great-granddad's the day before the injuries actually were recorded. Also, she then goes on to say, actually, he isn't actually my great-granddad, it's just my friend's father. So again, even that's a lie. She then later down the line will try to say that she thought the injuries had happened whilst Aniya was at daycare. And because apparently Aniya's come home at times and said, oh, I get injured at daycare. But she also said that the reason that she didn't believe her daughter is that because Aniya has lied in the past. We are talking about a very small child at this point. Lying in the past? This is a child who isn't even at the point where they recognise they can manipulate the world around them by telling a few porky pies. This is a small infant. This is a young child, a toddler. And we're now blaming the victim and we're blaming anyone else that we can blame, even a made-up great-grandfather who isn't even yours. Now, a social worker does attend the hospital, and at this point, when Aniya is interviewed, she says, "Mommy did it." And what do we all expect at this moment? That somebody's going to rush in and save this child, because she could not be more clear. Mummy did it. Now, despite this, caseworkers said, just wait for this. They said that because of Aniya's age and because of her development, she couldn't comprehend or be interviewed regarding the allegations, which is absolute BS, let me tell you. We interview children incredibly young. We take them incredibly seriously, and rightfully so, because they are experiencing and enduring things at home. And with respect, they may not be able to eloquently describe what's going on, but Aniya has. She said, Mummy did it. She's told several workers, Mummy's doing this. Why are they not listening? So Aniya's statements are discounted. They were actually discounted, in fact, as unintelligible or confused, despite repeatedly stating that her mother caused the injuries. The lack of care and concern and compassion towards this child is cruel beyond measure, because everything is played in at this moment to a point where this child should be removed from the care of her mother. Sierra is not fit, it's very obvious. She's very abusive, that's very obvious too. And this is a point where they could have swooped in, and I would not be telling this story if that had happened. Now, when they spoke to Sierra, of course, she's just going to tell them what we expect her to tell them. I've never seen any of these marks. I didn't know anything about these injuries. I don't know how she really got injured. But obviously, she tells that story that maybe it was playing out with other kids. Maybe it was when she was at the great-granddad's, who isn't really her granddad, and so on and so forth. The social worker also noted that the emergency room doctor apparently was unable to determine whether Aniya's injuries were caused by abuse, which isn't true. In fact, the hospital's discharge summary which was literally signed by the same doctor, clearly stated that Aniya's injuries were consistent with abuse. So this caseworker is lying. And we have to ask ourselves the question, why? What's the interest of this social worker in not actually taking the child's complaint seriously and believing a mother who everyone is screaming is abusing their child, who has evidence that is consistent with that abuse, including the testimony of a doctor who writes that down? It's willful, as far as I'm concerned. It makes that caseworker entirely culpable for what's going to play out, as well as, of course, the predators in this case. Now, that discharge summary that I was just talking about, that was literally included in the Children's Services file. So at the end of the day, they had that case file, they did nothing about it. Despite that, both the caseworker and the caseworker's supervisor never even reviewed those medical reports. The caseworker is an abomination. It's as simple as that. The investigation actually spanned 39 days. After that, there were no subsequent observations of Aniya. In fact, they never actually visited her after that first meeting at the hospital. This is despite the fact that the daycare workers and the emergency room doctor both suspected abuse, and that gave them great grounds to remove that child, and yet no removal occurred. In fact, an attorney later said, "I think it sums up the entire fiasco. There was clearly a lack of communication, lack of supervision, and lack of training. Just an overall lack of overall care, in my opinion. It is tragic that the agency put into place to protect the most vulnerable individuals in our society, young children like this, failed Aniya Garrett, Michael Garrett, and the Garrett family. It's just a tragedy." And it is a tragedy. But it's a tragedy that didn't need to play out because all of the evidence was right in front of their faces. Now, Aniya ends up attending Harbour Crest Daycare only one more time after that incident, and we all know why. At this point, her mother removes her without any explanation whatsoever, but clearly she doesn't want the prying eyes of the nursery to actually be causing her these issues. And that's dangerous, of course, for Aniya, because it means that those very caring, compassionate human beings who have been deeply concerned about her are no longer present in her world. Now, at this point, Sierra does enroll her into another daycare centre, and it's called Get Ready, Set, Grow. Guess what? It's where Sierra actually works herself. When I think about who I would wish to take care of my babies, aside from me, and I have a spectrum of Jesus to the devil, Sierra is literally just behind the devil on that spectrum. And the idea that she has access to other people's children when she is abusing her child at home is horrifying. So now she's going to work with her mum. Now, no one's going to be taking notes because, of course, they work with her. Now, silence is going to become a prison. So this places Aniya in a childcare environment that's literally controlled by her mother. And she's no longer in that safe childcare setting where staff have previously made those injury reports. And that is terrifying because we know how these things escalate. Because let's be clear, no one's going to be taking any kind of formal procedures against Sierra at that childcare facility where she works because there'll be some kind of allegiance between her and the staff. Now we get to July 2017. This is the first time we're going to hear about Deontay Lewis. So there's a family party going on and Sierra takes him to that family party, basically introduces him at that moment in time as her new boyfriend. This is his platform to be introduced to the rest of the family. And from then on, basically he is there with her all the time. In fact, Sierra's sister later said in court, they were always together. Every time Sierra came around, Deontay was there, he had a car, so he was basically her ride. Every time I saw my sister, I saw Deontay. So we are going to put him main center with her when it comes down to being around the child that they're both meant to protect. Now, Deontay Lewis was in his late 20s at the time of this crime. There's very limited public information about his early life or his background, but what we do know, he's now present in Sierra's daily life, and he's often staying at the apartment, so he's very much a primary caregiver, although we could say a lack of caregiver in this situation. So in 2017, we already have seen this litany of issues, and now there is a new partner who is going to be somebody that Sierra is going to want to give attention. And of course, what gets in the way of attention? Children get in the way of attention because, you know, you want to do your own thing, you want to have fun, and you've got a kid that needs you. And bear in mind, Sierra has very few nurturing traits, end of. So now this new partner is in her life, the attention's going to be on him. Now, Aniya's biological father, he is still present in his daughter's life. He wants to be able to provide constant care for his daughter, and he's getting really worried. So he's observed bruising on her chest, he's observed bruising on her lower back during a visit. Again, highly atypical. Think about your kids. Think about your friends' kids. Think about all the kids you've had in your life. When you were at school, how many of them ended up with bruises on the chest and lower back? It just doesn't make sense. They're not typical accidents for children to have where those injuries occur. He also said that one of the things that really concerned him was she had a really severely decayed tooth. And when he questions Aniya about this, she says, "Mummy pushed me up the stairs." So again, who's she bringing in? Frontline and centre, Sierra. Sierra is the abuser. She's even telling her dad, who's desperately caring for this child and wants desperately to have this child in his world permanently. And he's doing exactly what's right. He's photographing the injuries, he's reporting it to the police, but the allegations deemed unsubstantiated. And even worse, a temporary restraining order was actually granted against him. So Sierra tells yet another lie, and this is believed, and it results in this temporary restraining order. Now, we'll note that Michael Garrett has denied any claims of domestic abuse. He also never actually received notice of the court hearing, so he was unable to defend himself against those charges, which is harrowing. And of course, he is the line of support that Aniya desperately needs. And really sadly, after this, he never sees his daughter Aniya again. He couldn't check on her condition, he couldn't seek medical care on her behalf, and one of the things that family courts have been guilty of in the past is believing the female's word without really doing some due diligence. And when it comes down to child custody cases and so on and so forth, we have to remember there can be a lot of tension because of the breakup. And some people will use children as a pawn. They will use it to basically harm the other party. And certainly I feel that the moment that he dared to raise issues against her, she was going to pull out every stop to make sure that he seemed to be the problem. But of course we know Aniya hasn't been with him very regularly. She's been under the care of her mother primarily, and this is where the injuries have happened. And this is what Aniya is telling people, authority-wise, when it comes down to the injuries she's received. Now, around this same time, Aniya's maternal aunt, she said she starts to see Aniya less frequently. Apparently there was a silly falling out over something really stupid, as she put it, but this seemed to result in Sierra feeling that she had a right to pull her from contact. And another thing that this aunt said was one of the concerns that she had was it was clear that Aniya wasn't growing. She was getting thinner by the day. And she still tried to stay in contact. She would text Sierra, she'd reach out to her on social media. She even tried going to her brother to reach out to her, but she just didn't get any responses. And over time, Aniya is no longer seen by anyone. She's no longer seen, as we know, by the daycare that's reported her injuries. She's no longer seen by her father after he's raised those concerns. And less frequently, she's seeing extended family members who've expressed any worry about the condition that she's in. So we are seeing what happens in these predatory relationships where a perpetrator isolates. You want to keep them away from anyone who can help because you don't want to change your behaviour. You're going to carry on being an abuser. So you just don't want people to call you out on that or to get you in trouble because of that. We get to December 2017. At this point, Aniya's utterly desperate father, he sends a letter to juvenile court. He asks for full custody. It's basically a desperate attempt to change Aniya's caregiving arrangement because, of course, we know he's been cut off at this point from actually seeing his daughter because he dared to raise concerns that are absolutely justified. And it actually read, "I truly, truly, truly feel as though our daughter, Aniya, is being abused at home physically, mentally, and that her life could possibly be in danger." What a prophet he was. What a prophecy he made. Isn't it absolutely harrowing that this is the man who helped create this beautiful child? And this is a man who wants to sustain that creation of this beautiful child. He wants to make sure she's safe, cared for. He wants to be compassionate towards her. He wants to give her a home full of love. And he can see that what is actually happening to this child is the direct opposite of what she requires. He also went on to write about the fact that he had no clue that Children's Services had investigated reports of abuse previously. He didn't know that she'd actually been to the hospital. So he'd been kept from this information that's very vital as far as he's concerned. And he also recorded a video where she, Aniya, had actually said she wants to live with him. She doesn't want to live with her mum, which is utterly heartbreaking when you have the backdrop of the information that I'm talking about today.
Aniya, you awake, baby? You up, mama? You want to go home to your mommy or you want to stay with me, baby? You want to go home to your mommy? What you mean, no? Huh? What you mean, no? You want to stay with me? You want to stay with Daddy? You sure? I love you. What? I love you more, honey.
Now, with respect to that video, what will happen in those circumstances is when the professionals are shown that video, they will likely believe, because it's convenient to do this, that the father has been coercing his daughter into doing the video, and it's because he's angry with his ex. And it's devastating because it means that they're comfortable discounting it without actually doing the jigsaw pieces that are required to make the full puzzle, which is clear from all the evidence that's been presented already and in line with the doctor's report on top of what she's telling the father. So this is an absolute very clear picture. If you put the pieces of that jigsaw puzzle together, they aren't doing that, and that's shame on them. Now, this same month, Children's Services received yet another report. I mean, it's like they should have a hotline for it, because genuinely, they are getting so many calls, they're getting so much information, and it's almost as if there is somebody there just going, yeah, I can't be bothered. Yeah, I can't be bothered. That's how frustrating and infuriating this is, because we're dealing with a child who's in serious danger. Now, the reason that this report is filed is because Sierra's own sister has observed things that she's very concerned about. So she actually calls Aniya's father, and she also speaks to Children and Family Services. And she says, look, I think that Aniya's being abused. I don't feel that something's right in that home. I feel like she's being hid and kept away. I feel like we need something desperately to be intervened at this point, because otherwise something terrible could happen. And bear in mind, they also had the grace to say, I think Sierra needs help herself. Now, because of this, a social worker does actually attempt multiple home visits, but Sierra at this point says that Aniya isn't home. So she's just magically out every single time, and the social care worker just accepts that. But then eventually she does get to actually observe Aniya, and during that visit, that worker observes a faint bruise and a scrape. So you just have to do the maths. She's been kept from seeing that caseworker because she obviously had visible bruises, and Sierra's realised that caseworker isn't going to go away, so until they've faded to a point where they can be explained away, she's not allowed the child to see the worker. Now, Sierra also got really upset with the worker and claimed that she was feeling and being harassed. Do you know what? People use that loaded language so often. When you're a professional working in this arena, you will get those kind of comments levied at you because it makes you afraid. Bear in mind, people who work in these careers, you often belong to certain bodies, people with complaints in about you. It's a long process, it's deeply stressful. And when people use words like harassed, it means that you have identified me and you are going about trying to impact my life in a really negative way, which is not deserved. And it's the same as when somebody says that you're being very aggressive with me. Unless somebody is biting, slapping, or attacking you, they're not actually being aggressive with you. What people are trying to do on a professional level is to make you feel afraid that there'll be consequences if you carry on doing the job that you're doing. And she knows how to use this language effectively. And it's effective because she basically, again, says, look, these injuries, they happened at my grandfather's house, who isn't a grandfather's house, and the caseworker basically observed the rest of the apartment. So she did go and check on whether the utilities were working, that Aniya had a place to sleep, that there was adequate food and clothing, and that is confirmed, which is ironic because Aniya is getting more and more thin. So it doesn't matter the food in the cupboard. The thing is the food in the child's stomach. Now, that caseworker did continue to investigate, and they did that mainly because the person who made the report was entirely adamant about the concerns. But again, that case is closed. It's noted as unsubstantiated in January 2018. Let that sink in. And again, what is that telling you a story of? It's telling you a story of people not doing a reflective exercise. Read the files. Read the files. That's how you see the picture. Ultimately, don't just deal with this concern. Actually do the background history of what's going on for this small child. It is completely atypical for a child to have this many reports made about what's happening to them without there being some actual credible reality to why those things have been taken. And you as a worker should absolutely be going out and out to ensure that this child is protected. Now, between 2017 and 2018, Children and Family Services, again, are alerted to concerns about Aniya a further 5 separate times. Now, it's around this particular time that Sierra moves to Cultural Garden Apartments. At this point, obviously, Aniya is with her. And then in February 2018, Sierra actually tells the brother that Aniya can no longer walk. Can no longer walk. How distressing is that to even imagine and envisage? This is a little girl, a toddler basically still, and she can't walk. Now, he's so concerned about that information, he goes to the apartment, he sees Aniya lying on the bed, he admits that he never actually saw her get up, and he asks her if she's cool. She says, yeah, of course she's going to. She's going to be terrified of a living situation. She's not going to want to say anything against her abuser who's present. Now, he said later down the line, he figured that she couldn't walk because of her ankle hurt, and I would imagine that's because Sierra will have told him that. Sierra also apparently confided in her brother that she was eating very little, but even though apparently she couldn't walk and she's eating very little, no medical intervention follows. Now, just put yourself in that position. It wouldn't have to be your child. It could be any child. If a child that is within your circle suddenly stops being able to walk, isn't eating food, or is eating very little food, you are going to be on the phone to emergency services immediately because that is not right. There is something neurological going on or very physically damaging going on that a child is no longer able to walk. And they do nothing. Also, by this point, interestingly enough, Child Services had finally visited her biological father's home, who was desperate. Michael was desperate to have his little girl live with him. They wanted to check that it was suitable for a child, which it absolutely was. And they then set up a following appointment for March 12th. But heartbreakingly, that appointment, that so needed appointment, that so needed intervention never comes. And the reason for that is on Sunday, the March 11th, 2018, at 3:24 p.m., Deontay Lewis calls 911 from the apartment complex off Lakeshore Boulevard near Sims Park in New Slid. He tells the dispatchers that 4-year-old Aniya is having trouble breathing and is unresponsive. Now, during that call, Sierra tells them that Aniya's been sick and she's been vomiting, apparently since eating out at Red Lobster days earlier. What are we seeing here? That pattern of lies. Oh, I'll just say, we took her to Red Lobster because we're such great parents, you know? We're taking her out, we're having fun with her, we're feeding her, she's getting nutrition. And yeah, after that happened, ironically, she got seriously unwell. Oh, how convenient, Sierra.
What do you need an ambulance for, sir?
Yes, hi. My daughter's having a hard time breathing. She's breathing, but she's barely breathing.
Is she conscious now?
Is she conscious? Yes, but she's not really breathing. She's not speaking. She's not responding to us.
Is she awake?
Her eyes are open. Yes.
So she's not really alert?
She's not saying anything or responding to our.
Now, she also at this point claims to have attempted mouth-to-mouth, but she says that she can't feel air coming out. And again, she's asked multiple times to confirm whether Aniya is breathing, and she confirms that Aniya isn't breathing. Now, let me tell you, if there is one thing I can say about Sierra, it's that she has such flat effect throughout this case. When you watch her on interrogations, you just see that flat effect. There is no emotional cogence. There's no relatability actually to what's happening, to what's playing out. If this was your child, you would be incomprehensible because you would be blindsided by how desperately ill they are. Or worse, she just never comes across that way. Now, paramedics arrived at 3:30 p.m. This is when they sadly find Aniya lying underneath an air conditioning unit. She just looks immediately on sight to be severely malnourished. Also, they note that she had a black eye. She also had a laceration above her eye. She has bruises, cuts, and also burns on her body. How are you going to explain that one away, Sierra? Burns on your little girl's body? Now, understandably, they're desperate to try to help her. They do CPR, but there's absolutely no use to. Dashcam footage eventually shows them carrying that beautiful little girl's body to the ambulance. And medics reported that her heart wasn't beating. They also observed all those areas of injury, and the ambulance left within minutes of arriving. They then take her to Euclid General Hospital. She gets there at 3:37 p.m. She's pronounced dead. at 3:40 p.m. It's as simple as that. There's nothing they could have done. Now, the officers who attended the scene, they documented that she appeared to have been deceased for some time prior to the 911 call. The paramedics described Aniya as unresponsive, as cold and stiff, with visible injuries and extreme emaciation. Now, just so you're aware, I'm sure many of you already know this, but a body actually gets stiff from rigor mortis around 2 to 3 hours after the initial death. It peaks around 12 hours. This is when the body's entirely stiff, and then it will gradually resolve within 24 to 48 hours, typically. So it's clear. They hadn't rang when she was unwell. They hadn't rang when she was distressed. They'd rang way after her death. And so many of the witnesses who actually came across that scene said Aniya was skin and bones. Now, when it came down to the medical examiner, Dr. Joseph Philo, he performed the autopsy. It was harrowing what came back. So he observed that she was severely malnourished. She weighed only 26 pounds. So that puts her in the 3rd percentile for children her age. She's highly underweight. He also observed a very prominent black eye, also a laceration of her upper eyelid, and he believed that had happened approximately 2 days prior to her death. He also said that her eyelids were so swollen that it was difficult for him to pry them open to observe her eyes during the autopsy. We're talking about a baby here, a really small child. Aniya also had a bruise on the right side of her forehead, and he said that that had been about a week old. She also had some abrasions on her left arm and her back and areas of her lower legs and feet where apparently the skin had just sloughed off. That's the quote that I'm taking from the report. He also said that she started to form bed sores on her lower legs as well. So that's contextual with her not walking anymore because she's not moving around. You're going to get those sores. And also she's so thin, she's going to be far more likely to develop those sores. When it came down to the internal examination, well, that led him to conclude that Aniya had died a very slow death. So there was evidence of previous injury on the inside of her head in the form of a healing blood clot on her brain. So that injury itself, it had basically caused pressure to build on her brain, and that then would have caused her to have a series of strokes. And Dr. Fellow believed that the strokes would have occurred approximately 2 weeks to 3 months prior to her death. Now, because of those strokes, Aniya suffered from a lack of oxygen to the brain, so that actually caused the back part of her brain to die. Now, bear in mind that part of the brain is responsible for muscle coordination, so that's going to make her become really clumsy and uncoordinated if she's actually able to walk at all. The strokes also really sadly started her organs to deteriorate. So her lungs were collapsing because she wasn't taking deep breaths. Her pancreas was digesting itself because she wasn't eating. And the internal lining of her stomach was eroding because of starvation. We're talking about a little girl in the Western world with so many opportunities for healthcare and protection. How is this happening? When it came down to Dr. Philo ruling on the cause of death, he said it was a cerebral infarction, a stroke, and it was due to blunt impact to the head with subdural hematoma and contributing as well malnourishment. So the manner of death at this point was ruled, rightly so, as a homicide. Now, later that day, investigators actually go over to the apartment and they said it was clinically clean, unusually clean. One detective actually said it was practically immaculate and it smelled strongly of bleach. We all know why. We know they've done a clean-up job because we know there would have been blood. We know there would have been obvious issues, and that would have forensically made it very clear that it was pointing in the direction of who was guilty. And the fact that this idea that she's going to come out with shortly, which is it's all an accident, just makes no sense whatsoever. So what Sierra starts talking about with the detectives is this idea that she'd fell ill. Aniya just fell ill. She'd ate a large meal. You know, this child who's emaciated to a degree where she looks like she has been starved to death as a contributing factor to her dying. Yeah, she was actually eating a really large meal at the Red Lobster restaurant. So, you know, I'm a great parent. It's not my fault my child ate this incredibly exquisite meal that she enjoyed, had so much of, but then sadly it must have been diseased to some degree, so now she's got super sick. Yeah, it's nothing to do with me.
What do you call them? It was like some pasta spaghetti with what do you call that? Pasta spaghetti with pasta spaghetti. It's not crab liver, but it's shrimp. With shrimp, and she had some other stuff or whatever. But she was doing fine when we was there. She was having a good time. When we left, we went home as a family, sat down, watched movies and stuff.
She also claims that she didn't want to eat after she became ill to kind of evidence why she looks so thin. I mean, at the end of the day, I'm a great parent. I take her out, I feed her, she has big meals, but I can't help it if she gets a sickness bug. And of course, you've got a sickness bug, you don't want to eat. So she's thinking about, how do I explain the fact that this child looks so emaciated? Bear in mind, we're talking about a woman who is meant to be trained in this area to the degree where she works in childcare facilities herself. So she cannot pretend that she's not schooled in this arena, even though she will try to suggest that she didn't actually notice there was anything wrong with Aniya when it came down to her weight. So it is clear at this point she's tried to create this very flimsy alibi as to why Aniya is so malnourished.
We kept trying to feed her, and that didn't work. I'm like, I don't want to keep stuffing her because she easily chokes. I was concerned because she wasn't taking her down. So I did it again. I gave her some Tylenol, and my dude gave her some ginger ale. That didn't hold, whatever. So come Saturday or whatever, Aniya threw up again. I'm like, babe, I'm very, very concerned or whatever. So he was like, just let her lay down or whatever. So we let her lay down. He went to the store. He got her some soup.
What day was that?
For Saturday. He had got her some
Saturday.
soup.
Okay.
And she explains to detectives the day that Aniya falls sick and the day that she becomes unresponsive and how she's attempting CPR, because of course she's the hero in this story. She's doing the best for her child. She wants her child to be okay, even though she knows absolutely that it was beyond any hope or possibility that her daughter could be saved by the time those emergency responders arrived. But this is the game that she's playing.
She was doing some aqua breathing or whatever. So I took her out the tub. I'm like, baby, I think we're going to have to call the paramedics. I don't know what to do. So I noticed she stopped breathing for a minute. I'm like, so I tried to do CPR. I put 2 hands on her, and I did that. And it's like she came back. It's like she was gasping her. She had came back.
She also goes on to say how she basically heard a boom in the bathroom. And when she went to investigate, Aniya's fallen off the toilet in the bathroom.
We already talked about the eye. You explained how you said that happened. She also has a bruise on her head right here in the bum. What is that from?
I mean, she fell straight to the floor.
She fell straight to the floor?
Straight to the floor.
When?
Saturday evening, like I told you, she fell straight to the floor, and that's when I started doing all the nursery stuff on her, peroxide, putting the warm stuff on her face.
Where did she fall to the floor from?
From the toilet. By the bathtub.
I mean, this is ludicrous anyway, because as we know, the medical report is going to evidence the fact that Aniya wouldn't have been able to walk by herself. She's been so desperately impacted by blunt force trauma to the degree where she's had multiple strokes. But we're meant to believe that she's just taken herself off to the toilet and, oh, she's fallen off the toilet. She's fallen off the toilet and had a catastrophic injury to the point where, as we know, she's now dead. Now, bear in mind, at this point, Sierra is playing the game that she doesn't actually know her daughter is deceased at all. She's playing the game that she thinks her daughter might be just sick. We all know that she knows fully that her daughter's dead, but she wants to seem innocent, and to do that, she has to play into this idea that she was doing everything right, including call emergency services when there was still hope for her daughter.
You stayed in bed until the evening on Sunday?
Mm-hmm. Say it again.
What time do you think it was in the evening on Sunday?
I don't remember. I was more focused on Aniya and the way she was acting.
But the idea that you are trying to impress on the detectives who are skilled in this arena that your child could fall off a toilet at the weight that she is, bear that in mind, so she's very light, and actually injure herself catastrophically is ludicrous. Also, bear in mind, of course, she can't evidence that she saw her daughter fall because she's in the kitchen. So, she's just doing her best to put the pieces together. She tells the detective that her and Lewis stayed in bed all day on the Sunday. Bear in mind, they're meant to have a really sick child. She's told them that they went to Red Lobster and I got super sick and kept throwing up. Why would you have a child being so unwell whilst you just lie in bed all day? And of course, that makes the detective immediately skeptical. Also, the detective has 4 children of her own, so it's not going down the path that she wants when it comes down to this particular detective just buying into the story. She has kids of her own. She knows the way that children act. She knows the weight a child should be at. So immediately, this detective is going to really press her for fine details to evidence the fact that these are all lies. Now, she tells that detective that she gave Aniya a bath because apparently she thought that would help. At this point, Aniya becomes sleepy and wants to lie down, and then she just starts to begin CPR and calls 911.
Okay. And then you laid her back down after the bath. Then what happened?
She kept acting like she couldn't breathe.
Okay.
So that's when I did the CPR thing.
Okay.
And I kept doing it over and over. And I also did mouth to mouth too. And that didn't help.
Okay. Okay. Are you trained in rescue breathing with your early childhood?
I took classes and stuff. That's why I prolonged to do CPR on her with 2 hands. Because that's what you're supposed to do. Because she's only 4 years old. She's a kid.
Okay.
It just seems so ridiculous. There's no depth or weight or nuance to any of what she's talking about. It's just this direct, oh, I don't really know what happened. She wanted a bath. She got allergic to Johnson & Johnson. That's another thing that she's going to say. That's why she's got these kind of wounds on her skin. It just makes no sense, but she genuinely feels she can give these really flimsy details and the detective's going to buy into it. But bear in mind, if you have got away with abusing a child for a very long period of time and there's been no consequences to your actions, well, of course, you're going to believe that you can do more of the same in this situation with the detective. Now, the detective isn't having it, although they are very respectful during this particular conversation, and they basically bring up the fact that there's this extensive log of injury reports. Sierra at this point says they took it out of proportion. So she's saying, yeah, those injuries are there, but they're just all taken out of proportion. Oh, they're just a bit out of proportion. I'm not really sure they are out of proportion though, because they're actually documented. No, they're documented completely out of proportion. A bit like the fact that you think that these injuries are out of proportion and you also think you have a great-grandfather even though you don't. Yeah, that kind of out of proportion. The out of proportion where I'm just massively lying about everything. But anyway, this is what she's going to play.
Right now it's March 2018, so we're talking about 10 months ago. There was an investigation involving Children and Family Services.
Yes, it was from Aniya Day-Garrett.
Okay. Can you explain to me what that was about?
A scratch on her head.
How did it go when Children and Family Services followed up with you about that?
Well, first thing they do is go to your home, make sure you got food, make sure your daughter got clothes and shoes, and make sure her home is clean. They talked to me. They was like, you don't look like an abusive mother. I'm like, I'm not. Kids get scratches, scars anywhere. People blow it out of proportion.
Sure.
And they was concerned, but the scratch wasn't that to be all, oh my God. I mean, it's a daycare, so I guess they took it out of proportion or whatever. But when they called, she came up to my house. She was like, you have a lovely home. Aniya seems happy. You got food. She checked to see if she had a bed, shoes, and clothes. And she didn't find nothing, basically.
And she essentially says, look, the bruises and cuts on Aniya's legs is down to her using Johnson & Johnson body wash that's in a pink bottle. I think we all know that particular body wash. Anyone who's got a child or knows a child will have seen those pink bottles. A lot of people use it. And she basically is saying there's been some kind of allergic reaction. She also says, look, I called a doctor to tell them about Aniya being ill the previous days, but she can't actually evidence who the doctor is. And also, the detective's like, oh, that's cool. Can I just see your phone? Because I just want to absolutely clarify that you called that particular individual. And she's like, oh, no, I can't really do that because I delete everything. I mean, if I'm not deleting everything on my phone, I don't know what I'm doing. Could you imagine the amount of time these days with the amount of push notifications and calls and texts and Snapchats and all the other millions of things that people get? You would actually go to delete every single thing off your phone. But that, again, is the lie that she's telling you. She's wise to it. She thinks to herself, I don't want them to see that I'm just BSing. I don't want them to believe that they can find anything on my phone that's incriminating because I just delete everything and that's going to make sense to them. I mean, it doesn't. It incriminates her immediately. Nobody does that. Now, the detective does make it clear that she doesn't believe what Sierra is telling her. Also, very much presses home the fact that none of her daughter's injuries are consistent with her claims. And the detective even puts pictures in front of her to explain the injuries and also the malnourishment.
Well, the problem is everything you're telling me is nothing is consistent with the way that Aniya is presented, okay? The way that she appears, the injuries she suffered, nothing that you're saying is making any sense.
How come it's not?
I don't know why.
I mean, that's why I brought her to you. That's why I brought her to the hospital because I thought she was acting weird.
When did you bring her to the hospital?
Today, they took her.
Okay, you mean you called?
When I called.
Well, Deontay called 911. Right. Okay.
Now, if you are a parent and you're suddenly having that harsh reality, seeing pictures of your child that have been taken as her body's been taken to the hospital and examined, so that's where they've taken the photographs, and you already know that your child's dead because you were the one who killed her and led to her death, you should have some kind of emotional reaction. Now, I get that she's trying to pretend that she thinks her daughter's alive still, but there is just something so deeply broken in this woman's emotional psyche. It just doesn't register. It's terrifying. If you're shown pictures of your child who is just malnourished and badly injured, you would imagine that there would be some kind of connection in that situation, no matter how brutal you've been. Just some kind of flash of emotion, tears, whatever. But it just isn't there. She then says, oh no, the weight loss is because I didn't notice it. Just didn't notice it. And also it was just so sudden in the days before her death. Now, again, many of us will have had a virus or some kind of bacterial infection where we have found ourselves vomiting and we've lost weight quickly. You don't look like you've starved to death. You don't look like that. That's not how it occurs. It's not how it happens. And if you do continue to lose weight over a period of time, relatively quickly, over weeks or a few months, you go and speak to a medical expert because you're worried about what's happening. And let me tell you, everyone notices when people lose weight. It's as simple as that. You've not seen your friend for a few months, they walk in, they've lost weight, you go, oh, you've lost a bit of weight. It's just the way we are. We operate in that way. The fact that she's saying that she lives with this child and hadn't even noticed it shows devastating level of neglect. And yet she sees it as a defense. This is how cuckoo she is when it comes down to her fantasy of getting away with this. She thinks that by saying, oh, I just didn't notice the fact that this child was starving to death on my watch, that's going to be an accepted defense. And she makes lie after lie up for the whole interview. It is actually pretty devastating that somebody can find it so simple to just weave this web of intricate lies that make no sense, but to her make sense when we're talking about the fact that this is her trying to get away with the murder of her child. Now, when they speak to Lewis, he again downplays any abuse. He is asked, what's the discipline like in the household? She's asked the same question. And guess what? They both coordinate. He basically says Sierra's the person who handles the discipline within the home, which is fair enough. She's the biological parent. That's how it should be. And of course, Sierra tells a tale of the fact that she gives them time out. At the end of the day, she gets 4 minutes because she's 4 years of age. And that's 1 minute per year. No, she doesn't. We know what's happening to that beautiful little girl. We know she's being beaten horribly. We know she's being horribly abused. But this is the way that Sierra is trying to portray herself.
What is the discipline like when Aniya misbehaves?
Really nothing at all. Honestly, she'll see her have a go in the corner, stand in the corner or something like that. Other than that, it really be nothing, be like, just stop doing certain little things, we might not give you no candy at the moment because, you're being bad. But other than that, that's just pretty much as far as it goes.
He again tells the story of hearing the boom, where she hits her head in the bathroom, oh, just like Sierra had said, a boom. Now, again, that is a really unusual use of language as far as I'm concerned. A boom. A boom is something like an explosion. It's really loud. It's when the ground shakes. It's shocking. You might say a bang. You heard a bang. I've certainly heard a bang where my children are concerned when they've fallen off something. Not a loud one, but one that alerts me that something might have happened. I need to go and check that they're okay. But like I said, they both used the word boom. They have absolutely coordinated this bizarre story, clearly whilst trying to clean up the crime scene. Now, the detective just presses and says, look, okay, we'll give you the fact that you're explaining what's happened today, and we'll acknowledge in this moment in time this is the story that you are actually telling us. But we are worried about all these other injuries. Now, of course, what does he do? He just makes loads of excuses. He blames the cuts on her legs as being from the new Johnson & Johnson soap they used. And again, it's ludicrous because if a child is suffering an allergic reaction and it's really serious to the point where they've got sores that look like burns, because that's clearly what they're trying to suggest, you are going to get them to the emergency room. It's as simple as that. Because allergic reactions can be external and be very present by the way that it looks on our skin, but it can also signal internal issues. Throats closing up, kids not being able to breathe. You need to get them to the emergency room so they can be treated appropriately. And yet that hasn't happened. Now, when she's questioned in her interview on this, of course, she's going to tell the story where, oh, she has this allergic reaction, but only from her waist down because I didn't actually use the soap on her top body. It's just that she was sat in the bath and that's where the allergic reaction occurred. Again, ludicrous. But this is how they've coordinated their stories. And again, he says, oh, is that stuff from the pink bottle? They've planned the stories together, albeit badly. So he goes down the same route as Ciara. He says that she fell ill after eating the Red Lobster, that she was still alive when they were calling 911.
Her nose was open, everything was fine. Her pupils were perfectly fine and everything. So,
Her eyes were open, pupils were fine?
Yes. Yes.
Um,
But the breathing was just like making us nervous, and I was just like, we need to call.
okay.
And during his interview, he also goes on a few times that he wants to know how Ciara is doing. I'm just going to throw it out there. Who are you going to be concerned about when a child in your care has been unresponsive, seems on the brink of death? Are you going to be concerned about them and how they're doing, or about how the perfectly well mother, who clearly has whatever she wants to eat because she isn't a skinny woman, she obviously eats well? Why are you going to be concerned about her? Why are you concerned about Ciara? It shows a complete lack of care about that beautiful little girl who we know is now dead. He just doesn't care about her at all. And when he's asked to describe his relationship with Ciara, he says that they're great people, they're brought up in the church. Yeah, we're great people. How do you define great people? Well, we were brought up in the church. We literally brought up in a church. Not actually in the church, but we were brought up in the church. So you're trying to say that because you've attended church, that would exonerate you from any crime? Exactly. Exactly that. How is Ciara, by the way? Oh, what's that large light coming down from the dagger of light through your heart straight to hell? Okay, that would be effective for me when it comes down to how God would like to treat them in this situation. Sorry, I know those things don't happen, but wouldn't it be amazing? Wouldn't it be amazing if God just dealt with it instantly? You know, when people start lying and fabricating in detective interviews about something that they're trying to avoid taking responsibility for, and all of a sudden the heavens open up and this big white flash of electric light in the shape of a dagger just goes straight through them, and then they're just transported to hell. That would make me feel better. It would genuinely make me feel better a great deal. It would also help with the prisons because they're really overcrowded right now. So I'm just saying it would be kind of a really effective service. So he is really trying hard to paint him and Ciara in this positive light, this religious couple, this great set of caregivers to this child. Now, after this particular detective has pressed him for around 2 hours, another detective steps in. And as we know, at this point, he's pretending that he thinks that that little girl is still alive. And now he's going to get the news that she's actually dead. But he knows that already.
We just got some news. Yes, sir. Get some news. What's it? Aniya? Aniya?
Mm-hmm.
Aniya. I didn't make it.
Huh?
Aniya didn't make it.
Now, this particular detective takes a more stern, more confrontational approach than the previous detective. He also talks extensively about how those injuries did not add up to just an accident. But again, Lewis just refuses to admit anything. That's for a whole hour that they press him. But he says, no, I've told you what I've told you, and that's the truth. He keeps blaming the Johnson & Johnson for the cuts. He denies that he or Ciara ever hit the little girl, and basically say that she's been fed really well, but she just doesn't want to eat. So it's her that's the problem. It's the 4-year-old child that's the problem, not the caregivers. Now, it does not take long for the police to have enough information at the apartment, at the hospital, that is directly pointing at Lewis and at Ciara Day as being the culprits responsible for the death of this child. So at that point, they charge them both in connection with Aniya's death. We get to March 19, 2018. This is when Day and Lewis appear in court for the first time. This is when they are both charged with aggravated murder and other related felony offences. Now, they both, as we'd expect, enter a plea of not guilty. Bond at this point is set for $1 million for each defendant. We get to May 2018. So this is when the criminal case moves towards the grand jury proceedings. The Ohio Department of Job and Family Services announced at this point to intend to revoke the licenses of 2 daycare centres which Aniya had attended. So their move, Family Services, who have failed hugely, they're basically pointing the blame in the direction of the daycare centres that Aniya attended. Now, the agency cited failures to report suspected abuse or neglect as required under Ohio law. I do believe that those initial complaints should have been raised more seriously. I absolutely 100% agree with that. But the daycare facilities, they basically argued back. They said, you are scapegoating us. You're the ones at fault, and you're trying to point the blame in our direction. So the owners and administrators of the daycare centres, they actually denied the state's findings and they appealed. And the owner of Get Ready, Set, Grow actually called the complaint a total lie and said, how can we see something that's not there? Now, the attorneys representing Get Ready, Set, Grow, that was the one that Sierra actually worked at, the mother worked at and took her child to. They said it's unconscionable to us that nothing was done by Cuyahoga County to protect Aniya and to keep her safe. They then said the audacity to file a complaint 11 days after the death of Aniya. It's a shame that the county did not make the same kind of effort to protect Aniya while she was living. And I think we would all agree with that, wouldn't we? Now, at the time that that complaint was filed, the agency is already under loads of intense scrutiny for its handling of the case, or manhandling and mishandling of the case. And there ended up being a large but very peaceful protest that occurred outside CCDCFS headquarters. Community members basically were calling at this point for a federal investigation into the agency's policies and procedures. And that actual protest was led by her biological father, Michael Garrett. So you can imagine this guy must have been absolutely devastated. Aside from losing his daughter, he was doing his best to try to protect her and he was getting nowhere. And he was so close that potentially she could have been moved to him and her life would have had such a different outcome. The very fact that he's rallying the community to protest demonstrates the kind of man he is. And I genuinely feel absolutely devastated for Michael in this case. He just deserves so much more. Now, the case, it proceeded to trial in late February 2019. It was held in Cuyahoga County Court of Common Pleas. Now, the trial was actually conducted jointly. This is despite objections from both defendants. Their attorneys basically argued that the defences were incompatible and that a joint trial would prejudice their clients. But the court denied this request. I mean, it's kind of bizarre, isn't it? We just feel that, if the jury hear all the evidence on all of the really incriminating factors and kind of put it together that they're both involved in this, that could be really bad for our clients. So we'd like to just do it separately so we can try to prevent lots of evidence getting brought in. So that just sounds like you're trying to get off really guilty people. We absolutely are. That's our job and we're willing to do it. Like I said, comes down to the reality of them just thinking that they can probably get away with certain information being left out if they have separate trials. But like I said, the court denies that request and allows the case to proceed with both defendants tied together. Now, the opening statements for this case began on February the 28th, 2019. At this point, the prosecution did a really good job of framing the case as one not just involving that immediacy of violence, that moment of violence, but instead this sustained pattern of abuse and neglect. Now, Lewis's defense, they argued that he was not Aniya's parent. He didn't have any legal custody over Aniya and he didn't even live with Sierra Day. So they're trying to minimize his actual involvement. His attorneys actually told the jurors how Lewis had discovered Aniya already injured, that he attempted CPR. So they're saying, look, the moment he found the child, he tried to help the child. They're basically trying to say, look, he didn't see these things going on behind closed doors. She didn't do it in front of him. That's how they're mitigating what he did. So they are saying Lewis is being unfairly blamed for actions that he didn't actually commit. Now, the courts, they found that Lewis did not need to be a legal parent to have a duty of care. So at the end of the day, his regular presence, his authority and his involvement is enough to put him in that caregiver position. Now, when it came down to Sierra Day's defence, not that she had one, they focused basically on challenging the medical conclusions and also intent elements of the charges. Now, her attorneys literally urged jurors to withhold judgment until hearing all expert testimony, suggesting that Aniya's fatal injuries could have resulted from an accident rather than intentional harm. What we're saying is, just wait. Okay, we will wait because we're a jury and that's actually what our job is. Yeah, we're just saying wait because, at the end of the day, all of this expert testimony that can come in, that might seem to suggest that she was brutalised and tortured and finally died in these horrendous circumstances and that it's totally to do with Sierra Day. Or you might hear from, one of our experts who'll say, well, it could have been an accident. Jurors already sitting there shaking their heads going, yeah, they're definitely guilty. As simple as that. There's no defense here. I don't care what expert you bring in. It's going to get absolutely trounced just by the medical examiner's initial autopsy report. Full stop. But basically that's what they're trying to do. They're saying she could have just had an accident. You know, at the end of the day, there was no intention here. It's ludicrous. The child was battered and bruised. She had multiple strokes. She couldn't walk. Are we having a joke in this situation in court, suggesting that it could have happened by accident? Now, jurors also heard from emergency dispatchers and first responders who testified about March the 11th, about the 911 call, and also about their arrival at the department. So dispatcher testimony revealed that it took more than 3 minutes for Day to clearly state that the child's not breathing. She talks about everything else. Just put yourself in that position. If you're a mother and you think your child is unresponsive, well, somebody else is going to have to do the phone call, because I would be hysterical and beside myself and would make no sense. And yes, I do know that about myself because I've made one of those calls before and I am useless. The idea that I would be talking about anything if I had the capacity to do that, aside from the position and condition of my child, is ludicrous. So again, that in itself is deeply suspect. Now, paramedics who attended the scene, they said that Aniya was in a dreadful state when they found her. It was clear that she was skin and bones. It was clear that she was already dead. The deputy medical examiner, Dr. Joseph Philo, he described how Aniya weighed only 26 pounds at the time of her death. It was clear that she was profoundly malnourished. He also explained that the reason he classified it as a homicide was because of the horrific injuries. And he gave a really in-depth description of those injuries. He said, listen, these are not consistent with a simple fall. And he went on to also talk about how malnutrition was a contributing factor in her death. Also, they brought in family members, and those family members testified about Aniya's declining conditions in the months leading up to her death. They brought in reports about the fact that she couldn't walk. Sierra's own sister, Erica Johnson, she testified that she had absolutely noticed Aniya getting thinner and thinner. This was as early as July 2017, but also noted that that got even more obvious after Lewis came into the picture. And of course, we see this mother as completely neglectful anyway, abusive beyond measure. When she gets a new partner, well, Aniya's going to be a real hassle. So the abuse is going to escalate because she wants time with Lewis. Her sister actually said Sierra didn't really seem like a child. She was very standoffish. She didn't seem happy. Of course, this child isn't going to trust anyone. She's not going to trust adults. If your own mother can do this to you, you're not going to look at other adults for help. She's already tried that at the daycare centre and no one's taken her seriously. Obviously, we know the worker at the daycare centre did, but when it comes down to the people who could really help her, they just let her stay in this torturous condition. So of course, she probably seems standoffish. She doesn't want to get anything wrong. She's probably terrified of making an incorrect move because she's going to get beaten horribly for it. And that sister said that she actually observed at one point Sierra taking this beautiful 4-year-old child into another room for discipline that she clearly didn't deserve. And when she came out of the room, Aniya had a bloody nose. And she asked Sierra about it, says, why has she got a bloody nose? And of course, what does Sierra say without even taking a breath? Oh, she fell, she hit her face. Now, this same sister said that she saw bruises and scratches on Aniya whenever she saw her. And when Sierra's asked about it, again, it's always somebody else's fault. It's the daycare, or it's a friend. It's somebody else that's done this. She's not the responsible party. Now, one of the things I suppose that the sister does corroborate to some degree is that she never actually saw Lewis discipline Aniya. But she does note the physical changes became more noticeable. So he is watching this child be horribly abused. He is seeing how sick she is getting and he's doing nothing about it. The sister said she was getting smaller. I thought maybe it was to do with her getting taller. When toddlers grow, they slim out a little. But she was getting littler and littler to the point you could see the extension of her stomach sticking out. We get to March the 6th, 2019, after 6 days of testimony, after 37 witnesses, closing arguments were delivered. Prosecutors said Aniya had been beaten, starved, and denied medical care, and that both defendants were responsible. Assistant prosecutor Anna Faraglia described Sierra Day as a master manipulator, arguing that she systematically cut off access to Aniya whenever others tried to intervene, including daycare workers, family members, and Aniya's father. Prosecutors also tied the clean department directly to the tampering charge. Now, the defense attorneys, they basically were urging the jurors to set aside emotion. Could we just ask you jurors to set aside emotion? I don't know, because it's really emotional. Yeah, we're just saying just set aside emotion. But it's really emotional that a child has been tortured and brutalized to the point where that child is dead. We're saying emotion might be a bit of an issue. Well, it's just a kind of emotion is what drives us when it comes down to making certain decisions because we are emotionally moved by it. And we feel emotionally moved by this case, which is why we're saying, just put that to the side. Just approach this as if you were a piece of wood. I kid you not. Now, I totally understand that it is the job of a defence attorney to get the jury to be objective, but we're talking about a case where a child has been systematically abused and murdered. It's going to be hard to set your emotion aside. So what Day's attorney is basically arguing is that the medical examiner can't identify a single definitive mechanism of injury. So they suggest that an accidental fall remains a possibility. Just let me just work that one around. Yeah, go on. Yeah. So you're saying that because the medical examiner can't say it was this injury that killed her, you're saying therefore it could have been an accident. That's exactly it. You've got it in one. That's being objective for you. No. What I'm trying to figure out is how you would come to that conclusion. Because what the medical examiner is saying is there were so many injuries, there was a litany of injuries that could have led to her death that any of them could have been responsible. And as a culmination, were fatal. We're saying that you could see it that way. Or you could just see it like this. They can't identify a specific incident that killed her. So we're saying that specific incident could have been an accident. Are you following me? No, I'm not following you. Where's the big red guilty button? Oh, Maureen, if you could just press that 55,000 times. Honestly. But anyway, that's the road they're going down. When it came down to Lewis's attorney, they reiterated that Lewis lacked legal custody and didn't have the statutory duty alleged by the state. So they're going down that technical route. Well, he wasn't responsible. Well, he was responsible because he was there. No. He was legally not responsible. No, he legally was responsible because he was that. No, he was not a statutory caregiver. No. He was present whilst a child was being tortured and abused and starved to death, but he's not technically responsible. Again, Maureen, if you've got the big red button, can we just press it 3 times now? Honestly, again, this idea that as an adult, because you are not directly, statutorily responsible for a child, that you somehow don't have to report horrendous things happening to them. You've got eyes, you've got ears, you're meant to have a soul. Put those into practice and you're going to respond by actually seeking help for a child. He doesn't do that. Of course he's culpable. We get to March the 7th, 2019. At this point, the jury returned guilty verdicts against both the defendants, and of course they did. So Sierra Day and Deontay Lewis were convicted on multiple counts. This included aggravated murder, felonious assault, 3 counts of endangering children, permitting child abuse, and also tampering with evidence for the cleanup of that apartment. Prosecutor O'Malley said this: "And I never stood a chance at life with a mother like Sierra Day. Day and her boyfriend, Deontay Lewis, were held responsible today for the physical abuse and persistent and unfathomable neglect that led to Aniya's death." On March the 20th, 2019, Sierra Day was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. You deserve every single second of that, you heinous excuse of a human being. Deontay Lewis, he was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 20 years, which I am okay with. I genuinely think he's a heinous excuse of a human being like she is, but I do see that his role is distinct from hers, although, like I said, he failed her on every single level. Now, from the bench, the judge said this: "In my 24 years, I don't think I've seen such a callous disregard for human life that Sierra showed Aniya." And during the hearing, Aniya's devastated, heartbroken father, Michael Garrett, delivered a victim impact statement saying to Sierra Day, "How could you torture and murder your own flesh and blood?"
Don't look at me! Don't look at me! Kill my daughter!
Now, ironically, Lewis addressed the court as well and said, "I loved Aniya." Understandably, that was met, shall we say, with visible skepticism, because how could he have loved Aniya when he literally let her starve to death on his watch? Now, both of the defendants, as we'd expect, appealed their convictions, and in November 2020, the 8th District Court of Appeals affirmed Sierra Day's conviction in full, rejected any arguments related to trial errors, jury instructions, severance, and sufficiency of the evidence. Now, the appellate court did affirm most of Deontay Lewis's convictions, but they did order certain child endangering counts vacated, remanding the case for correction. So the court addressed Lewis's arguments that he was not a custodial figure under the statute, found sufficient in evidence to support the remaining convictions. But in February 2022, the Ohio Supreme Court declined to hear Lewis's appeal. Now, Aniya's father understandably filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Cuyahoga County and other entities. He alleged systematic failures by Child Protection Services, which I think I've outlined here. You all know there have been absolute failures on every level in this case. We get to June 2020, Cuyahoga County approved a $3 million settlement. Garrett rightfully said, no amount of money is ever going to replace the loss of my 4-year-old daughter. And he's actually now demanding that Cuyahoga County provide him with monthly updates on children's services improvements. And he says, look, it's clear that we absolutely need to press on and push hard because we need to prevent the mistakes that have been caused in the death of my own daughter. He said, because child lives do matter. There's no reason why a little 4-year-old girl who spoke out and said, help me, was not helped. That happened to be my beautiful princess. Oh, God, love that guy. I don't know how you survive these kind of situations. Now, there was a scathing 21-page report compiled by state officials that found the Cuyahoga County Division of Children and Family Services had failed at seemingly every single turn in its investigations. It found that social workers failed to properly conduct follow-up investigations, that they failed to conduct adequate interviews and observations, as well as failing to follow procedures. Now, according to state records, the services recommended 3 times that Aniya's mother receive counselling. But at no point did they ensure that she actually sought the recommended counselling. It was also found that at least on one occasion, one of the reports of the alleged abuse was not screened into the agency correctly. Instead, the report was screened into a category that isn't intended to assess cases of suspected abuse or neglect. Additionally, at least one report was not initiated within 24 hours, which is literally required by the state. Now, in the late 2000s, the CCDCFS had implemented a continuous quality improvement unit. That role, therefore, within that unit is to review cases for compliance with local and state procedures, in addition to basically looking for trends and patterns. However, the state review found that shortly after the unit was created, it was disbanded after the supervisor retired and the assistant supervisor moved to another agency. I kid you not. Just like create this so that we can make sure that we're following trends and patterns and issues, and then, oh, they've left to get another job and we'll just leave it then. When we talk about lessons learned, this is why lessons never are, because these kind of bizarre units are set up to do apparent good, and yet they do nothing at all. And who pays the price? People like Aniya pay the price. Her dad, Michael, pays the price. Why does society pay the price when we lose these little angels? Again, I'm telling a story where so many opportunities were there to help this child, and no help came. Even when she said it was my mummy. It was my mummy. She's doing this to me. They just said she was incoherent. They couldn't take the word of a child. If you can't take the word of a victim, you're never going to help the victim. If a child literally telling you, my mum's done this, isn't enough, then no child can be saved. It has to be enough. Aniya's voice needed to be enough. I know that you, like me, will want to dedicate this particular moment to Aniya. She's not in pain anymore. She's in bliss as far as I believe. And 100%, I believe that she'll see her daddy again. She won't see her mother again because her mother is in flames in hell when she takes her last breath. It's as simple as that. Anyway, let me know your thoughts as ever. I appreciate each and every one of you. And let's dedicate this moment to that beautiful 4-year-old little girl who deserves so much more.